Welcome back to this Microsoft Virtual Academy course on open source database on Microsoft Azure. This is module 4, and in this module we're going to cover how we manage and monitor open source systems, open source database in Azure. I'm Damien Caro, Technical Evangelist Manager.
And I'm Oğuz Pastırmacı, Technical Evangelist.
So when it's about monitoring and managing database or monitoring and managing and deploying systems in Azure, there are multiple options. First option is to use actually third-party solutions. We're going to cover which are the third-party solutions that we have been working with the most to provide a seamless, transparent, continuous deployment and configuration in Azure. We'll also cover how you can deploy systems using Azure Automation, and we're going to have an example on how to deploy a Percona cluster in Azure using that approach. And finally, we'll touch a bit monitoring and how we monitor what's going on there. And we'll do some little demos, and we'll see how we can push a bit the Azure infrastructure around storage. So third-party solutions. The third-party solutions that I'm going to expose are two partners that the Azure team has been working with to allow an implementation of a descriptive approach. And those third-party solutions work very well with Linux or open source environment. They have a lot of resources that are available for Linux systems. One of them is Chef, and the other one is Puppet. There are two main companies providing solutions in this environment, and they're both partners of Microsoft. They all have the descriptive approach. The descriptive approach means you describe in a file the configuration that you want to achieve, and their solution will actually make it happen. They define what is the goal state, and that goal state will actually arrive, considering that there is no bugs and issues on things, but the client, their agent, will make it happen. Chef has some resources available on Supermarket. It's always interesting to go to a supermarket to get a Chef recipe, but that's the way they position it. And there is a MySQL recipe, for example. We've been focusing a lot on MySQL recently. That is maintained by Chef, and I will show you where it is and how we can use it. Puppet has also a lot of community resources on puppetlabs.com, and there is a MySQL configuration module on forge.puppetlabs.com where you can find the latest version. The one I had was the 2.2.3, but that module is evolving as well. So those two resources, those two third-party solutions, basically provide an integrated approach with Microsoft Azure. One of the examples is to deploy a MySQL system or MySQL server using the MySQL recipe with Chef. The way it works is we configure in Azure the extension, the Chef extension. The Chef extension, let me bring the laser. The Chef extension is just a checkbox as we deploy the VM. We need two files. The first file is the RB file, the client RB. That file defines and configures the client agent on the machine. And the PEM key, which is basically a certificate that will authentify the client against the Chef server. And then we define the run list. The run list being the list of recipes that we want to apply on that system. And what Azure will do, the Azure agent will actually communicate with the configuration, get and install the Chef agent, and configure the Chef agent as the machine is being deployed. So at the end of the day, you will basically get a VM configured with the configuration you want. So let's have a look in reality how it works. Let's have a little demo around that. So I'm going to switch to what we call the old portal, which is the one that we currently have today, and that's the one that is not in preview. And I'm going to create a new virtual machine. So I'm going to follow the steps that most of you have already done already. I'm going to take an Ubuntu VM, the 14.04 version, MVA demo 2. I'm going to use a standard tier. I want a VM with some cores, so I will probably go for an A3 with 4 cores and 7 gig of RAM. I'm going to use a password. I know it's not necessarily the best thing to do, but it should be good. I'm going to create a new cloud service. I'm going to call it, MVA demo 2 is already taken, so 2.1. Yes, it's live demo. Western Europe, yeah, it's good. And I'm going to use an existing storage account. And here's when you take the checkbox. So I'm going to use the chef checkbox, client RB. I'm going to take the file from my disk. So I have the client file already there. But I could select the file from a storage account. So I could upload those files on storage account, and I would be totally independent and not relying on anything. I'm going to take the PEM file, my certificate as well. There we go. And then I need to type the run list. So the run list is going to be the recipe. I'll come to the recipe in a minute and show you how it looks. So I need to type it correctly, recipe, MySQL. So MySQL is basically the name of my recipe, and I'm going to specifically say I want the server. And I just need to check, complete. So now, Azure is provisioning a VM, injecting the Azure agent. The Azure agent will inject the Chef agent, and the Chef agent will actually communicate to the Chef server to get its configuration. So the Chef server look like that. That's my demo environment. And the recipe appears under the policy node, the policy tab. And I can look for my MySQL recipe. So I'm using the latest version of the recipe. And if we look in the content has a structure. It has attributes and it has recipes. One of them is for the server. So if I look at the server, it goes under the definition of the whole MySQL service. So the MySQL service, I would be able to define the version, the port, and everything. All those elements, all the version that I want for those, all those value for those files come from the attribute. So I left the default configuration, but for example, in the attributes, you can define the password for your MySQL, for the root. You can define some service name, or you can define a bunch of things like the port on which MySQL is going to listen. So all those elements will come through the recipe. The MySQL server will be configured with those parameters. And after the deployment is complete, I just have my server up and running. We can then go to nodes and see when the node is going to appear. When the node appears here, it means it has been registered with the chef system and has actually applied the configuration. It is not there yet. It will take a few minutes to get there, but it will appear at one point. What I suggest is while we wait for MySQL to be deployed and installed, we switch back to the demo, to the slides, and see a different way to automate the deployment of systems, MySQL or Linux systems in Azure.
So that means if I'm already using recipes in my on-premises environment, I can just keep using them for deploying virtual machines.
Absolutely. And you see, it used the same infrastructure, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just switch from whatever virtual environment you have to Azure, and you just reuse whatever you've done, the intellectual property. So, the second approach you can use to deploy and manage systems in Azure is around Azure Automation. Azure Automation is a service that runs within Azure. You need one asset, which is an automation account. You just need to create one account. That account will bring some elements, like the assets that you need to use, like certificates, passwords. Those kinds of elements are assets. Then you need to import modules. By default, Azure Automation comes with a certain set of modules coming with PowerShell, but you can always import your own modules, or you can upgrade the modules that are provided so that you have the latest version of the modules. And what Azure Automation does, it actually runs a PowerShell workflow. So you build your workflow or your workflows, and they will run at a defined time with defined properties, or you can run them manually if you want to try something. We'll come to the Azure PowerShell module version through the demo. I'm going to switch to my machine and show you how you do it. And the last thing that I'm using for Azure Automation to configure the Linux VM is the set Azure VM extension. So when you deploy a VM through PowerShell, you have the ability to define a custom Linux extension. And the set Azure VM extension will allow you to define which shell or which bash script you want to run at the deployment time. Again, it's the Azure agent that will call the shell or the script that you have provided and will run that script when it starts and when it runs. Let's switch to my demo machine and let's have a look at how it looks. So, if I'm going to automation, so I'm now in Azure Automation. Azure Automation has an account. I have an account created. And we have the different element I was talking about. You have the assets and the runbooks, which basically is a workflow. In the assets, you can have certificates, you can have connection strings, you can have credentials, or you can upload modules. All those assets will be used or can be used and leveraged by the runbook when they run. You can import a module. The module is a zip file. So one of the tricks you have to consider here, the PowerShell commandlet that comes by default in the environment usually lag behind the PowerShell commandlet that you can install through the web platform installer. So what you want to do is you want to go to Program Files, x86, Microsoft SDK, Azure, PowerShell. This is where, when you install the PowerShell commandlet, this is where the module is going to be located. Then you have two folders. The Resource Manager, which is the new API to manage Azure, and the Service Management. Service management is the one we use traditionally to manage Azure so far. And you have different directories that represent different things and different commandlet and the different resources you can manage. What you want to do is take the Azure folder, create a zip file, desktop is fine, and then in the Azure automation, you want to import a module and browse for that zip file, which is on the desktop. It's going to check if the zip file is correct. If nothing is wrong, you can click the OK box, and the module will be imported on Azure Automation as a resource. Then you can create a runbook. I'm going to the author to show you how it looks. So the runbook that I have here basically takes few parameters as the entry. You can always define the default version. And then you basically run a script. So I'm not going to the details of the script. You define your Azure subscription. And then the purpose of that script is to deploy a Percona MySQL cluster. So I get a bunch of elements like the VM config to create my virtual machines. And once I have my VM, I wait for that VM to be provisioned. So that's when I do the kind of a loop on waiting for the VM to report started state. And here's the fun thing. I use that part of the script to use or to configure a custom script extension. So the first thing is to define the storage account name, which file I have, and my storage account key to access my file. So the file is on a blob URI, DevOps file blob.core.windows.net demo, and I have my script file over there. Then I defined 3 variables, the extension, publisher, and the version. And then I set the Azure VM extension, apply the extension to the VM that I have deployed, and I just update my VM. So what will happen then? It will actually get the VM running, ask the Azure agent to run the shell that is available on my blob storage. So we can test it. The test will ask me different elements like number of nodes, the service name. I'm going to give a name. I know it's not existing. 2015. I select the VM image, the VM name, click complete, and it's actually running a runbook. And I can look at the output. The output will create 3 VMs in the same VNet. The 3 VMs in the same VNet will be connected, and I will have a MySQL Percona cluster up and running. So it takes about 15 minutes to get it running, so we'll let it go, and we'll check later on.
So you just use PowerShell, basically?
It's kind of using PowerShell for that. But you don't need to have PowerShell installed on your machine to get that running. You can do it basically from any system that exists. You can do it from a Mac, you can do it from Linux VM, you can even do it from a phone if you want to code on the phone.
But again, if you have already invested some kind of scripting, you can just continue using them without doing major modifications. And it's a very powerful thing because you can use Chef, Puppet, PowerShell. So again, we are providing options about how you can do things.
Correct. That's multiple options for you to deploy things. Let's check if my VM has appeared here. Need to refresh the nodes. Takes a while to refresh the page.
While it's refreshing, one other thing I like is it prevents human error. So we are all humans. We can have, installing MySQL from the command line. It's really easy. But we can have a phone call. Our friend can just text us in WhatsApp, whatever. So we can just skip doing one step. But if you're using that sort of automation tools, it just does what you ask it to do. If there's a problem, it just says, okay, I couldn't do this because that happened. So once you have a set of scripts for you, it's just no-brainer. Just start using it, and it saves you time. It makes your day much more easier than doing everything manually.
Correct. And that also allows you to have a consistent, repetitive approach. So if you do dev and test, you can take the same script, the same configuration, and apply it to a different set of VMs, which allows you not only to save time, but to make sure you reproduce what is in production in test, or vice versa. I'm just looking at my browser, and I see that my Azure VM 8 with the FQDN MVA demo 2 is up and running. It checked in with the Chef server 2 minutes ago, so it should be fresh. Mm-hmm. We see the run list is good. It has the MySQL server installed. So let's see if we can connect to that VM. I just want to verify the name, MVA demo 21. MVA demo 21. cloudapp.net. It responds. That's a good sign. I'm connected. So let's see if the service is running. Oops. It's running, process 4219. So I know it's running. Now I could have applied different configuration passwords, and now it's up to the rest of the configuration. But for the bare metal, having the service up and running, we have it. Pretty nice. So the last piece that is important to me, after we've deployed, after we know exactly what we're configuring, we need to monitor what's going on. We need to have a clue on, is my machine performing as expected? Do I have the right sizing for my machine? Because you always say, yeah, I'm going to go with let's say a G5 VM. We are rich, we have plenty of money, we want to go for a G5 VM. But is it the right size? Is it the right scale? Does it make sense to go for a G5 if I can go with an A2 VM? Maybe I need to make sure that I have the right fit for my environment. And that will bring cost efficiency. It will bring the ability to adjust to the proper amount of expenses versus how much the service I'm supporting brings to the company. So it's the equation of revenue versus cost. And that's the value of the cloud, having the ability to create that equation in a very efficient way. So monitoring, operating this environment, and actually it doesn't matter if it's MySQL, Percona, Galera, MongoDB, whatever database it is the principle of the cloud. But the monitoring piece is a highly important piece to make sure you're exactly right size for what you have to deliver. So in Azure, you can monitor two things. The first thing is the storage account. Is my storage account performing as I'm expecting? And that's a pure technical point of view. Do I get the right performance? And the second one is monitoring VMs. I need to monitor my VM. Does it have the right I/O levels? Does it goes above the I/O level? Is it below, that kind of things. So instead of talking on that slide, I prefer to go and play with the portal.
Go ahead.
So the monitoring exists in the old portal, but I have a little preference for the new portal. It has improved, I should say. So let's look at storage account first. So I'm going to browse. And the new portal brings in the blade the recent object that I've been looking at. So I have my 2 VMs, but I also have my storage account. The MVA Linux we've created and the MVADB storage we've created earlier today. I'm looking at MVA Linux. So the storage account brings me a summary of what's going on. How many containers I have, how many file shares, how many tables, all those kind of elements, even the keys that I can reset. But what I'm interested here is the monitoring piece. The monitoring piece brings me on a single pane of glass the number of total requests that I have received today, how much egress in terms of volume I had today, which latency I've seen on storage. So my average latency on the storage account, so I can drill down into that latency and I can open a bigger pane which allows me to look at every single point of measurement. So I know that for this blob storage, I had a 40.61 peak milliseconds on the blob. The average is 6 milliseconds with a max of 46. So am I happy with that? Is it not good? Is it good enough? I need to work on those things. And I can even create alerts.
So I can just say, if that happens, let me know.
Pretty much that's the idea. So for example, here on the storage account for the blob storage, oops, sorry, switched keyboard. You give a name, give a description, blah, blah, blah.
It's a good description.
It's a good description. And then you define the metric. So in that case, it's the average end-to-end latency. Just click OK. Oops. And you define the condition. So it has to be greater than 1 second over the last few minutes. So if that happens, I will receive an email as the admin. But you can also bring another email if you want to notify the owner of that application, for example, or for the owner of the VMs running on that storage account. You can notify them on an email, be in CC, but they're aware of what's going on in the environment.
Or I can just use this information to trigger something else. If I have other systems, I can just say, okay, go ahead and move this virtual machine, create this virtual machine, scale out, scale up.
Correct.
So it's really strong.
And once the rule has been created, you can come back to it, you can change the conditions, you can even disable it. So you know you're going to do performance testing on that storage account, or you're going to disable it. You want to know how it looks like?
Yeah, sure.
What if I go to my VM here, that is on the MVA Linux storage account? There is a tool called FIO. And FIO will generate some IOPS on storage. So you remember on that VM, we have mounted a disk earlier today.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if it's still there. It's still there. We still have content there. So let me get my command. So I've been lazy today. To make sure I'm not typing something wrong, I've prepared my command line. And we can run, so it generates IOs on a file. So in that case, the file is an MNT new disk test. And you generate a file of the size you want. So I can generate a file of 4 gig, for example. So it's going to do random IOs on the disk, simulate some load on the system, and it will create a file of 4 gigabytes. So it's going to take a bit of time to do it. But on the monitoring space of the storage account as well as the VM, we should see something happening because we were not expecting that. So let's say I'm a test, or my production environment goes crazy and generates random things like that. Well, a few minutes later, on my portal, I should see some peak happening. Actually, not even a few minutes later, we already start seeing some activities on the latency. We start seeing some load on the storage account. So you can see the request. That comes every 5 minutes, if I remember correctly. So on the blob storage, for example, on this storage account, I had 4,470 requests on the blob with a maximum of 8.94K. So if you are very strict on number of IOPS, number of requests, and you're like short, you want to monitor that very carefully so you don't hit the throttle of the storage of Azure. And you can create conditions, alert, and everything. Same thing here. So that is for storage. Now we have the same thing for VMs. So if you take my MVA Linux VM, I have the same monitoring approach. So I can monitor the CPU. I can monitor the CPU. And so far that VM hasn't been used except this little peak, like 5-ish%, 5-10% approximately. I have a visibility on the disk read and write, number of kilobytes coming in and out, which also gives me an idea on how the VM performs. And I have visibility on the network, how much is coming in and out. So if you look at disk, well, we had a peak, which was, the peak was here. It was 1.74 megabit per second. We're good. I mean, based on storage that we have, we're still good. We don't reach the limit. But I've created an alert. I want to see how much disk write byte per second I have. And I want an alert if that counter goes above 1,000 over the last 5 minutes. And I'm going to send an email to myself. So guess what? That happened when I reached the peak. I was above that limit. So you get those alerts, and you get an email like that. So the alert was like disk write greater than 1,000 in the last 5 minutes has been activated for this VM. So you know the VM. You also know the resource group. So that's the concept that comes with the new portal. We group resources into one single group. So the MVA resource group is the one I use to aggregate all the MVA resource we've been using today. So I know which VM, I know when, I know for what reason, and I can take action based on that. You even know the rule that has been used for that, and you know the time and everything. So it's a good monitoring piece that helps you control and react on what happens on your Azure environment.
Definitely very useful to know what's happening in your environment, whether it's in Azure or anywhere. You need to do some kind of monitoring.
You always need to know what's going on. At the same time, my job is like 10% done. So you see it's going to take a bit of time, about 30 minutes. I've been using a disk that is on standard storage. So I'm capped at about 400 IOPS with the current layout I have. It's connected with the 500 IOPS per disk that we have as a limit on every disk in a storage account. So we let it go, we let it generate some alerts that I will receive. So it will spam my box, my inbox at the same time. And after this course, I will have to clean up my environment. So in this module, we have seen how you can deploy a VM and configure it automatically using third-party solutions like Chef or Puppet. We've also seen how we can use Azure Automation to run PowerShell workflows script. You can name it differently if you want, to deploy and configure automatically Linux VMs in Azure and to deploy your database. And finally, we've seen how you can monitor and control what's going on at the storage level as well as at the VM level, which is very useful for open source database systems.
So I think that concludes our course.
I think so. It's been a great course around what is the open source database we support, how we need to consider storage options for deploying and having the best performance, how we get to a high availability environment, how we scale across regions, and how we monitor and configure those systems.
Thank you for joining us on this course. We hope it was beneficial for you. Again, check MVA for other great courses about specifically on open source software and also, of course, Microsoft products. And we hope to see you again with another course, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you.